In security, value alone does not determine risk. An asset can be extremely valuable and still be relatively safe. Another asset might be less valuable but highly exposed, and therefore far more likely to be attacked. That difference is explained by exposure conditions. Exposure conditions describe how, where, and under what circumstances an asset is accessible, intentionally or unintentionally. They explain how close an attacker can get to an asset. Security incidents rarely happen simply because an asset exists. They happen because an asset is exposed in a way that attackers can reach. Let's clarify an important distinction. Asset value answers the question, how bad would it be if this asset were compromised? Asset exposure answers a different question. How easy is it for an attacker to interact with this asset? Risk emerges when high value and high exposure overlap. Exposure is not binary. Assets are not simply exposed or not exposed. Exposure exists on a spectrum, shaped by multiple conditions working together. One of the most important exposure conditions is connectivity. Assets that are connected to networks, especially public networks, are naturally more exposed. A system accessible from the internet has a fundamentally different exposure profile than one isolated on an internal network. The more reachable an asset is, the more opportunities attackers have to probe it. Another major exposure condition is authentication strength. If an asset can be accessed without authentication, exposure is extremely high. Weak passwords, shared credentials, or missing multi-factor authentication significantly increase exposure, even if the asset itself is valuable and well designed. Exposure is not just about external attackers. Internal exposure matters just as much. Assets that are accessible to many users, roles, or systems have a larger attack surface. Every additional access path increases the chance of misuse, accidental or intentional. Misconfigurations are one of the most common drivers of exposure. An asset may be intended to be private but accidentally made public. A storage bucket, database, or admin interface exposed due to incorrect settings is often more dangerous than a deliberately public service, because protections were never designed for open access. Another critical exposure condition is data handling and movement. Assets that move frequently, backups, logs, exports, analytics datasets, are often copied into environments with weaker controls. Each copy increases exposure. An asset that is secure in one system may become exposed when duplicated elsewhere. Human behavior is also a major exposure factor. Phishing, social engineering, and simple mistakes can expose assets without any technical vulnerability being exploited. From an attacker's perspective, humans are often the easiest access path. This is why exposure conditions include not just systems, but processes and habits. Time is another often overlooked exposure condition. Assets exposed briefly but repeatedly can still be compromised. A system open just for testing or temporarily may be scanned and attacked within minutes. Attackers are constantly watching. Exposure also changes with context. An asset might be low risk in isolation, but high risk when combined with other access. For example, read-only data becomes dangerous when paired with write access elsewhere. A low-privilege account becomes valuable when it can be escalated. Attackers think in chains, not single points. This is why exposure conditions must be evaluated holistically. Security teams often underestimate exposure because they focus on design intent rather than operational reality. What matters is not how an asset should be exposed, but how it actually is exposed. Monitoring Logging and continuous assessment exist to close that gap. Reducing exposure does not always mean adding more security controls. Sometimes it means removing unnecessary access, disabling unused services, or simplifying architecture. A less exposed asset is often safer than a heavily protected but widely accessible one. From an attacker's point of view, exposure defines opportunity. They don't need to break into every system, only the ones that are reachable. Strong security aligns asset value, exposure conditions, and protection effort. High-value assets should have minimal exposure. If exposure is necessary, protections must increase proportionally. Exposure conditions change over time. New features, integrations, users, and business needs constantly reshape them. That's why exposure management is not a one-time task. It's an ongoing process of observation, adjustment, and restraint. Security failures often look complex from the outside, but at their core, many come down to a simple mismatch. An asset that was too exposed for its value. Understanding exposure conditions is how security moves from theory to reality.